Alejandro Wraithhand Serrano, a name whispered in the darker corners of the criminal underworld, is a figure who, to this day, remains an enigma. His story isn't one of wild violence or loud confrontations, rather, it's a quiet, methodical rise, a ghost-like figure who slipped in and out of the law's grasp with a precision that made him more myth than man. While the world knows the larger-than-life figures of organized crime, Wraithhand's legacy lies in the shadows, in his ability to operate under the radar, in the way he made the impossible seem effortless. But how did a man like him, with nothing more than his wits and an unshakable will, manage to carve out an empire that spanned continents and lasted decades? This is not just the story of a criminal mastermind, it's a tale of how one man, driven by ambition, survival, and a thirst for power, mastered the art of being untouchable. From the very beginning, Alejandro's life was set against the backdrop of a gritty, dangerous world. He wasn't born into wealth or luxury, nor was he raised by criminals. But the streets where he grew up were filled with temptation, with power struggles playing out in broad daylight. Alejandro learned early on that the rules of the world weren't the same for everyone. While others followed the law, there were those who didn't, those who bent it to their will, or better yet, made it irrelevant altogether. And it was this realization that set Alejandro on a path from which there was no turning back. What sets Alejandro apart from many of his contemporaries in the criminal world is that his rise wasn't driven by brute force or flashy displays of power. Instead, it was his mind, his ability to think 2 steps ahead of everyone else, that made him a legend. He was elusive, operating with an uncanny ability to vanish when needed, never leaving a trace. His nickname, Wraithhand, was more than just a moniker, it was a description of his ability to slip in and out of situations, unnoticed. Where others might have seen obstacles, Alejandro saw opportunities, ways to manipulate the system, outsmart his enemies, and build a network that would serve him well. But this wasn't just about avoiding capture or playing the game of crime with unmatched skill. Wraithhand's true genius was in his understanding of the human condition. He understood that power, in its purest form, wasn't about wealth or force, it was about control. And control, he knew, was about the ability to make people act in ways they didn't even realize they were being manipulated. He was always calm, always composed, a master of reading people, knowing exactly when to push and when to pull back. This psychological warfare, this ability to control the actions of those around him without them ever fully realizing it, was what made him so dangerous. As Alejandro's reputation grew, so did the myths surrounding him. His name became synonymous with mystery. Did he really have a hand in all the operations his name was attached to? Or was he simply the figurehead, the elusive ghost who let others do the dirty work while he stayed hidden? The truth, as with many legends, is somewhere in between. Alejandro was indeed a mastermind, but he was also a man who understood the importance of a carefully crafted image. He was always one step removed from the chaos, always just out of reach, and that distance only made him more captivating. His ability to remain a shadow, never fully revealing himself, allowed the myths to grow unchecked. People were drawn to his mystery, to the idea that he might be out there, operating in the dark corners of the world. For years, Alejandro managed to keep his empire running, all the while avoiding the prying eyes of law enforcement. There were no flashy escapes, no media spectacles like those of other notorious criminals. Instead, his operations were quiet, methodical, nothing more than a whisper in the night. But his power was undeniable. As the authorities tried and failed to catch him, a pattern began to emerge. The more they tried to find him, the more elusive he became. Each failure only added to the legend of Wraithhand. His ability to stay one step ahead of the law became a source of fascination, and even those who had no interest in crime couldn't help but be drawn into the story of a man who seemed to defy the very laws of reality. Despite his success in evading capture, Alejandro was never completely safe. There were always risks, always enemies watching from the shadows, waiting for a misstep, for a sign of weakness. And yet, Wraithhand thrived in this environment. He understood that in the criminal world, you couldn't afford to be too comfortable. Power was fleeting, and anyone who became complacent would eventually fall. Alejandro, ever the strategist, knew that to remain at the top, he had to stay sharp, stay hidden, and above all, stay unpredictable. His rise to power wasn't just about outsmarting the law, it was also about understanding the game of alliances and betrayals, of knowing who to trust and who to discard. In a world where loyalty was as fragile as glass, Alejandro's ability to read people was unmatched. He could tell who was loyal to him and who was merely using him for their own gain. And when betrayal came knocking, as it inevitably did, he was always ready to act, always with a coolness that made others question whether he had ever been rattled. There were no emotional outbursts, no impulsive actions, just cold, calculated decisions that kept him ahead of the game. But for all of his brilliance, Alejandro's story is also one of self-doubt and fear. The more successful he became, the more isolated he grew. The deeper he went into the criminal world, the harder it became to trust anyone. There were always whispers, always rumors, always people trying to take what was his. And as Alejandro's empire grew, so did the paranoia. In the end, it wasn't the law that posed the greatest threat to him, it was the constant fear of being betrayed by those closest to him. This fear gnawed at him, a silent, unspoken pressure that never left him, even as he continued to outmaneuver those who sought to bring him down. What's most captivating about Alejandro's story is the sense of unfinished business that lingers in the air. His name, his empire, his legacy, they all live on in whispers, in rumors, in the minds of those who still remember the ghost who once walked among them. The mystery of Wraithhand's disappearance is as compelling as his rise to power. Some say he's still out there, operating from the shadows. Others believe he's long gone, his empire crumbled, his influence lost to time. But one thing is certain, Alejandro Serrano, the man who slipped through the law's grasp time and time again, will never be forgotten. His story, though still shrouded in mystery, will continue to captivate those who dare to seek the truth. Alejandro Serrano was born into a world of hardship, a world where survival was not a guarantee but a daily struggle. His early years were marked by the kind of poverty that left a permanent scar on his psyche. Growing up in a rundown neighborhood where crime was as common as breathing, Alejandro quickly learned that the world around him wasn't fair. But instead of succumbing to the harsh reality, he became a keen observer, learning how power worked, how it could be seized, and how it could be used. The streets were his first school, and they taught him everything he needed to know. His family, though close-knit, was a product of this environment, fighting for every inch, every opportunity. Alejandro's father worked long hours in a job that barely paid the bills, and his mother, though loving and devoted, was often preoccupied with keeping the household running. They didn't have much, but there was always food on the table, and they were together. Yet, despite their best efforts, Alejandro could sense the frustration building in his father's eyes. His father had dreams, but those dreams were crushed by the weight of reality. He wanted more for his children, especially Alejandro, whom he saw as the one who might escape the life they had been handed. From a young age, Alejandro's ambition outgrew the narrow confines of his neighborhood. While his peers were content with small, fleeting pleasures, Alejandro wanted something more, something that would ensure he never had to live like this again. But the path to success, as he saw it, wasn't through education or the traditional routes others might take. Instead, it was through power, through the ability to control, to manipulate, to rise above the chaos and make the world bend to his will. The first real exposure to crime came when Alejandro was just a teenager. He was introduced to petty theft, small-time jobs that seemed harmless at first, but they opened doors to a much larger world. There was something intoxicating about the rush, the feeling of slipping past authority, of getting away with something that others would never dare attempt. Alejandro wasn't reckless, far from it. He had an almost calculating nature, taking care to keep a low profile, to stay out of the spotlight. This wasn't about glory, it was about control, about understanding the game before anyone else did. Soon, Alejandro's reputation began to grow. He was quiet, reserved, but there was a sharpness to him that caught the attention of the older, more experienced criminals in the area. They saw something in him, an intelligence, a focus, that set him apart from the others. He didn't just do the jobs, he understood the why and the how. He had a way of seeing things that others didn't. He learned quickly how to keep his hands clean while still pulling the strings behind the scenes. It wasn't long before he became known as someone who could get things done, someone who could be trusted with bigger, more dangerous operations. Yet, for all his natural talents, Alejandro never let himself become complacent. While others might have reveled in their newfound status within the criminal world, he kept his eyes on the prize, the ultimate goal, power. He knew that in the game of crime, those who were too visible often became targets, and those who made too many enemies were destined to fall. Alejandro didn't want to be just another criminal, he wanted to be untouchable. And to do that, he had to be patient, careful, and above all, invisible. The world around him began to change. The neighborhood was becoming more violent, more unpredictable. Gangs were taking over, and the streets were no longer safe. Alejandro had always been able to blend in, but now the risks were higher. People were getting more desperate, more unpredictable. He realized that to survive, he needed to align himself with the right people, those who could protect him while also helping him grow his influence. He wasn't interested in building a crew of loyal followers at first, he was more interested in finding the right allies, those who had the resources, the information, and the connections that could push him forward. But it wasn't enough to be connected, he had to become indispensable. It was during this time that Alejandro started to learn the real art of criminal enterprise. It wasn't just about stealing or running illegal goods, it was about networking, about building a web of connections that could support his rise to power. The more he learned, the more he understood that true power wasn't about violence, it was about control, manipulation, and timing. He began to see how everything in the criminal world was connected, how everything could be leveraged to his advantage. By the time he was in his early 20s, Alejandro had already made a name for himself in the city's underground. His connections had expanded, and he had begun to work with bigger players, individuals who operated on a much larger scale. These were the kinds of people who weren't just about street-level crime, they were involved in organized syndicates, international smuggling rings, and high-stakes operations. Alejandro knew that these were the people who could help him break free from the small-time game and move into the bigger leagues. But as he navigated this world, he began to understand the true nature of power. The streets may have been where Alejandro had grown up, but it was in the shadows that he truly learned how to wield power. He was no longer just a young man looking to escape poverty, he had become a player in a game that very few could comprehend. And it was here, in the murky waters of organized crime, that Alejandro would begin his rise to power, slowly, methodically, and with a patience that only made his eventual success all the more inevitable. But even as he grew more involved in the criminal world, Alejandro remained focused on one thing above all else, the ability to remain invisible. In a world where the most dangerous men were those who sought fame or recognition, Alejandro's greatest strength lay in his ability to operate in the background. He was the one pulling the strings, the one who made things happen without anyone ever knowing he was involved. His rise wasn't about drawing attention, it was about staying hidden, staying untouchable. The roots of Alejandro's success were planted in those early, formative years. It wasn't the crimes he committed that set him apart, it was his ability to learn, to adapt, and to operate in a world that demanded secrecy. Alejandro understood early on that in the criminal underworld, it wasn't the loudest voice that won, it was the quietest, the one who never made a move without thinking it through first. And so, with every step, he moved closer to the life he would one day lead, a life of power, control, and mystery. By the time Alejandro Serrano had reached his mid-teens, he had already left behind the innocence of his childhood. Life on the streets had a way of shaping those who lived there, especially someone as sharp and observant as him. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about making a name for himself in a world where respect was earned, not given. At this point, Alejandro's involvement in petty theft had evolved into something far more ambitious. What began as stealing food and small items to get by soon escalated into more sophisticated criminal activities. He wasn't just taking things anymore, he was learning how to run schemes, how to play the system, and how to make money in ways that others could only dream of. His early crimes weren't what you'd call big heists or dangerous robberies, but they were important. They were the first steps into a larger world, a world that, for most, was dangerous, chaotic, and filled with risk. But Alejandro was different. His mind worked in ways that others couldn't quite comprehend. While his peers were trying to get by, Alejandro was already planning his next move, always thinking ahead, always looking for an opportunity to rise above his circumstances. One of the first major turning points in Alejandro's young life came when he crossed paths with a group of seasoned criminals who were operating a small-time racket in the neighborhood. They were involved in various illegal activities, shakedowns, extortion, and petty theft, but it wasn't their actions that caught Alejandro's attention. It was their mindset. These men were living with a level of confidence that Alejandro had never seen before. They had access to resources, information, and connections that seemed almost untouchable. They moved through the world with a quiet kind of power, knowing exactly how to avoid the police and how to control people. It wasn't long before Alejandro found a way into their circle. He wasn't the loudest, or the toughest, or the most charismatic, but he had something that others lacked, a sharp mind and the ability to stay unnoticed. He learned from the edges, picking up small details about how the operation ran, understanding the rhythms of crime. He started to see that the real power wasn't in the theft itself, but in the planning, the orchestration, and the ability to stay 2 steps ahead of both the law and competitors. Alejandro knew that if he was ever going to make it out of the life he'd been born into, he needed to learn how to make people act in ways they didn't even know they were being manipulated. The more Alejandro learned, the more he realized that the streets could be his classroom. He didn't need to waste time with petty hustles or low-level scams. His ambitions were larger, and he started using his early experiences as stepping stones to bigger things. He began to put together small-time heists, targeting local businesses with a focus on high-value items that wouldn't attract too much attention. His first real test came when he orchestrated a break-in at a local jewelry store. The job was clean, well-planned, and perfectly executed. The thrill of the heist was overwhelming, and the success cemented something in Alejandro's mind: he wasn't just good at this, he was born for it. But even more importantly, Alejandro realized the importance of remaining under the radar. After his success with the jewelry store job, he didn't flaunt it. He didn't buy flashy clothes or try to act like a kingpin. Instead, he kept his head down, moving carefully, always making sure to erase his fingerprints from the world around him. He knew that attention was the enemy of power. So he continued operating in the shadows, quietly building a reputation. And with each job, he began to build something more valuable than money: he built a network. By now, Alejandro had become involved with some of the more influential figures in the criminal world, and it was through these connections that his understanding of the criminal enterprise began to take shape. The men he worked with weren't interested in petty theft or street-level crime. They were involved in much larger operations: drug trafficking, money laundering, arms dealing. These were the kinds of businesses that made millions, not just thousands. But to be a part of them, Alejandro knew he had to prove himself. And prove himself he did. He started taking on bigger and more complex jobs, each one pushing him further into the world of high-stakes crime. With every job, he learned something new, something that added to his arsenal of skills. He became a master at navigating the criminal underworld, understanding the intricacies of running large-scale operations. More importantly, he learned how to use people. He wasn't just a worker, he was a thinker, a strategist, a man who could move pawns around the board without anyone realizing it. One of the first large operations Alejandro got involved in was a drug distribution network that spanned several states. While the men running the operation were known for their ruthlessness, Alejandro was different. He wasn't interested in power for power's sake, he wanted control. And he knew that control came from managing everything, from the street-level dealers all the way up to the financiers who kept the operation running. The success of this operation marked the beginning of Alejandro's true rise to power. It wasn't enough to be good at what you did. In the criminal world, you had to be invaluable. You had to become the person who made everything run smoothly, the person who people couldn't afford to lose. By now, Alejandro had become the kind of man who operated in the shadows but whose influence stretched far beyond what people could see. He knew how to read people and how to manipulate situations to his advantage. He wasn't just involved in crimes, he was shaping them, directing them. And as his reputation grew, so did his power. Yet, despite his increasing success, Alejandro remained cautious. He didn't get greedy, and he never let his ego get in the way of his ambitions. He understood that in the criminal world, nothing was permanent. Power shifted, and allegiances could change in an instant. The key, he realized, was to stay flexible, to always have an exit strategy, and to make sure that if things went wrong, he had a way out. This was the mindset that would carry him through the most dangerous moments of his career. Looking back on those early years, it was clear that Alejandro's rise to power wasn't just about luck or connections, it was about his relentless drive to learn, adapt, and outthink everyone around him. Every job he took, every risk he ran, was a calculated move toward his ultimate goal. And with each success, he was one step closer to becoming the figure he would ultimately be remembered as, a man who would slip through the cracks of the law, a mastermind whose name would become a whisper in the dark, a legend who would never truly be caught. Alejandro Serrano's early career in the criminal world was defined not by recklessness, but by careful strategy and an unwavering commitment to his goals. He was a man who understood that real power wasn't about showing off or flaunting his abilities, it was about control, subtlety, and, above all, patience. As he moved deeper into the world of organized crime, he began to distance himself from the impulsive nature of street-level hustles. The stakes were higher now, and so were the rewards. Alejandro wasn't just involved in petty theft anymore, he was dealing with high-profile, high-risk operations that required a much more sophisticated understanding of the game. The first big test of his abilities came when Alejandro was asked to oversee a robbery of a high-end casino, one that was rumored to have millions in cash and chips stashed in a secure vault. The plan was simple on paper: break in, steal the money, and get out without anyone being the wiser. But Alejandro knew that nothing in the criminal world was ever as easy as it seemed. There were always variables, unexpected complications, law enforcement, rival gangs. The key to pulling off a job like this wasn't just about knowing how to get in, it was about knowing how to cover every angle, how to account for every possibility, and how to ensure that no one would even know you were involved. He spent weeks preparing for the job. He scouted the casino multiple times, noting every detail, the guards' routines, the layout of the building, the security systems, the blind spots. He observed the patterns, learning not just the physical layout of the place but the rhythms of the people who worked there. Alejandro understood that the human factor was just as important as the physical one. He used his quiet demeanor and sharp intellect to gather information from unsuspecting sources, employees who didn't realize they were giving him the keys to the kingdom. By the time the heist was set to go down, he knew the casino's operations better than most of the staff did. The night of the robbery was calm, too calm, perhaps. Alejandro had assembled a small, trusted crew, men who knew their roles and knew how to keep quiet. He wasn't interested in grand displays of force or violence, instead, he relied on precision. The plan was to disable the security systems, access the vault, and make off with the cash before anyone realized anything was wrong. There would be no screaming, no confrontations, just a quiet, calculated strike. Alejandro had made sure that the crew knew their roles, that everyone was prepared for every possible outcome, and most importantly, that no one would take unnecessary risks. As the hours passed, he watched the team work, amazed at their coordination. Each move was timed perfectly, every step preordained. It was the kind of efficiency that made Alejandro realize how far he had come, how much he had learned since those early days of petty theft. The heist itself went off without a hitch. In the dead of night, Alejandro's crew successfully bypassed the high-tech security system, accessed the vault, and took millions in cash and chips. The whole operation took less than an hour. They left no trace, not even a hint that they had been there. When the casino's management realized what had happened the next morning, they were left in a state of shock. The vault had been emptied, the alarms had been triggered, but no one had seen a thing. It was as if the thieves had vanished into thin air. Alejandro was at the height of his power. He was becoming a ghost, a figure whose name was whispered among those in the know, but whose true identity remained a mystery. As Alejandro watched the casino security footage, he smiled. There were no faces, no clues, only the result. The heist had been flawless. Yet, even in the midst of his success, Alejandro understood the deeper lesson: his true power didn't lie in the act itself, but in his ability to remain invisible, to let others take the credit or bear the consequences while he simply slipped away. His crew, though loyal, didn't truly understand the extent of his influence. They saw the success, the money, the thrill, but they didn't see the deeper game, the way Alejandro was setting up a network that would give him more power than any single job could. Despite the success, Alejandro knew that with every victory came new challenges. He wasn't the only player in town, and his rise hadn't gone unnoticed. As his name began to circulate in the criminal world, other powerful figures began to take an interest in him. Some saw him as a potential ally, others as a threat. It wasn't long before Alejandro found himself caught in the delicate dance of alliances and rivalries that defined the world he inhabited. While his ability to stay under the radar had worked in the past, the more powerful he became, the harder it was to remain invisible. Eventually, someone would notice, someone would seek to control him, or eliminate him. It was during this time that Alejandro began to realize the full weight of the game he was playing. In the criminal underworld, the difference between success and failure was razor-thin. Trust was a fragile thing, and alliances were often based on self-interest, not loyalty. Alejandro's rise had been marked by his ability to manipulate, to play both sides, to shift allegiances when necessary. But he also knew that in the end, his survival would depend on his ability to stay one step ahead of everyone else. The competition in the criminal world was fierce, and Alejandro quickly learned that you could never have too many allies. He wasn't interested in becoming a foot soldier in someone else's operation, he wanted to build his own empire. But to do that, he needed resources, more men, more operations, and more control over the networks he had begun to establish. This would require careful planning, even more strategic moves, and a deep understanding of the risks involved. It wasn't long before Alejandro began to expand his operations, setting up a number of lucrative rackets in different cities. His reach was growing, and his name was becoming synonymous with success. Yet, as his empire expanded, so did the number of people who wanted a piece of it. The larger Alejandro's network became, the more challenges he faced. Rival gangs, law enforcement, and even his own associates all posed potential threats to his growing power. But Alejandro was prepared. He knew how to keep his enemies close, how to outthink them before they had a chance to act. For Alejandro, power wasn't just about wealth, it was about control. And control meant being able to anticipate every move, every potential risk. He understood that in the world of organized crime, no one was ever truly safe, and even the most well-laid plans could go awry. That was why he always stayed calm, always thought several steps ahead. He knew that if he wanted to maintain his position at the top, he had to keep moving, keep expanding, keep adapting. And so, with each operation, each deal, he grew more powerful, more elusive, and more entrenched in the shadows of the criminal world. But even as Alejandro's power grew, he understood that no one could remain untouchable forever. In the back of his mind, there was always the lingering question: how long could he keep slipping through the law's fingers? And, perhaps more importantly, how long could he trust the very people who had helped him rise to power? His success had come at a cost, and as the years passed, Alejandro began to realize that no one could be trusted completely, not even those who had been with him from the beginning. As Alejandro Serrano's influence continued to grow, the criminal world began to shift around him. He wasn't just a small-time operator anymore, he had become a central figure in a much larger and more dangerous network. But with this rise to power came new challenges, new enemies, new risks, and the constant pressure to stay one step ahead of the law. Despite his ability to stay hidden, the deeper Alejandro delved into the underworld, the more vulnerable he became. People began to notice him. They began to talk about him. And in a world where reputation was everything, this could be both a blessing and a curse. Alejandro had learned early on that the key to survival in the criminal world wasn't just about being smart or ruthless, it was about being adaptable. He knew that in order to stay at the top, he had to remain flexible, constantly evolving his strategies and staying ahead of the competition. But adaptability wasn't just about outsmarting your rivals, it was also about understanding the ever-changing landscape of law enforcement. The game was shifting. The authorities were getting smarter, and the tools at their disposal were becoming more sophisticated. It wouldn't be long before Alejandro found himself in the crosshairs of a determined investigation. Yet, for all his careful planning, Alejandro also understood the unpredictable nature of the criminal world. The risks weren't always in his control. One misstep, one betrayal, one mistake could bring everything crashing down. And that's exactly what happened when he found himself tangled in a web of deceit that nearly unraveled his entire empire. It started with one of his most trusted associates, a man named Julio. Julio had been with Alejandro since the beginning, a quiet but capable man who knew how to get things done without drawing attention to himself. But in the criminal world, loyalty could be fleeting, and ambition was often more powerful than friendship. Alejandro had always known that his empire was built on shifting sands. He kept his circle tight, trusting only those who had proven themselves time and time again. But even the most loyal men could have their own hidden agendas. Julio, it seemed, had gotten too close to a rival gang. It wasn't uncommon for smaller crews to form alliances with one another, but this one felt different. Julio had been making deals behind Alejandro's back, and those deals weren't with people Alejandro would have ever associated with. Julio had decided that the growing tensions in Alejandro's organization could be the perfect opportunity to strike out on his own. When Alejandro first heard the rumors, he didn't believe them. He trusted Julio too much, and the thought that his longtime ally could betray him seemed impossible. But the whispers grew louder, and the evidence began to pile up. Julio's actions weren't just careless, they were intentional. He had been feeding information to the rival gang, helping them undermine Alejandro's operations and gain a foothold in areas that had once been his exclusive domain. It wasn't until Alejandro uncovered a direct link between Julio and the rival gang's leader, a man named Marco Vasquez, that he understood the full scope of the betrayal. Alejandro was furious. But he didn't act on impulse. He knew better than that. He was the mastermind, and in order to keep his empire intact, he had to remain in control. He gathered his most trusted men, the few who hadn't been tainted by the rumors, and began to devise a plan to deal with Julio. The first step was to confirm everything. There could be no room for doubt. Alejandro's team launched a quiet investigation into Julio's activities, tracking his movements, and intercepting his communications. The evidence was damning, and Alejandro knew that he couldn't let the betrayal go unpunished. But even as he prepared to deal with Julio, Alejandro's mind was already calculating his next move. He couldn't just eliminate the problem, he had to use this situation to his advantage. He knew that if he acted quickly, he could use Julio's betrayal as a way to eliminate not just one traitor, but an entire rival gang. Marco Vasquez had been a thorn in Alejandro's side for months, trying to edge in on his territory. If Alejandro could turn this situation to his advantage, he could not only get rid of the traitor within his ranks but also neutralize a significant threat to his empire. As Alejandro considered his options, he realized that he needed to take a more personal approach. The cold, calculated methods that had served him so well in the past wouldn't work here. Julio had to understand that betrayal came at a steep price, but Alejandro didn't want to risk losing face by making the situation public. He needed to keep control, keep his authority intact. He decided that he would confront Julio directly, but with a strategy in mind. He would make Julio think that he still had the upper hand, that he could escape the consequences of his actions. It was a dangerous game, but Alejandro was used to walking that line. The night of the confrontation was tense. Alejandro met with Julio in a secluded location, far from the eyes of the rest of the organization. There, in the dim light of a back room, Alejandro laid out the evidence. Julio's face paled as he saw the proof, but there was no turning back now. Alejandro spoke calmly, his voice steady. He made it clear that while Julio's betrayal was unacceptable, he was willing to let him walk away, if he cooperated. Alejandro's offer was simple: leave the gang and vanish, disappear from the criminal world entirely. He would be allowed to live, but only if he agreed to disappear for good. Julio, still reeling from the shock of being exposed, agreed to the terms. He had no other choice. Alejandro's reputation was such that no one who crossed him survived long. Julio understood the danger he was in, but he also knew that running wasn't as easy as it seemed. Alejandro wasn't just a boss, he was a force of nature, and crossing him was a death sentence. With Julio out of the picture, Alejandro turned his attention to Marco Vasquez. The rival gang leader had been testing Alejandro's limits, but now, with his own ranks weakened, he was vulnerable. Alejandro had no intention of letting Marco take advantage of the situation. He launched a swift and brutal campaign against the rival gang, dismantling their operations piece by piece. Within weeks, Marco's empire crumbled, and his network was exposed. Alejandro had turned Julio's betrayal into a victory, eliminating both a traitor within his own ranks and a dangerous rival in one fell swoop. But as Alejandro surveyed the damage and the fallout from the conflict, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. The game had become more dangerous, and there was a growing sense that he was no longer the untouchable figure he once was. His empire was expanding, but so were the threats. Alejandro had learned to trust few people, but even those few could become liabilities. The delicate balance he had worked so hard to create was beginning to feel more unstable, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As he sat alone in his office late that night, Alejandro realized that his journey had only just begun. His rise to power had been marked by intelligence and calculated risks, but the future was uncertain. The further he pushed forward, the more enemies he would make, and the more difficult it would be to stay at the top. But Alejandro wasn't the type to back down. If anything, the challenges ahead only fueled his ambition. And with every move, he became more determined to cement his place in the world of organized crime, not just as a player, but as a legend. As Alejandro Serrano's power and influence continued to grow, the complexity of his operations began to increase exponentially. What started as small-time heists and low-risk scams had transformed into a sprawling criminal empire that spanned multiple cities, involved high-level operations, and touched every corner of the illicit world. With that growth came new challenges, not just from law enforcement, but from his own people. Alejandro understood that the more successful he became, the more likely someone would try to take his throne, either from within or from without. One of the most pressing issues Alejandro now faced was the loyalty of his inner circle. He had worked hard to build trust, but trust was a fragile thing in the world of organized crime. Even the most loyal men could be swayed by money, ambition, or the desire to see someone else take the fall for their mistakes. Alejandro had learned this lesson the hard way after Julio's betrayal, and now he was even more determined to maintain control. He knew that in the underworld, weakness was a death sentence. If he showed any vulnerability, his enemies, both inside and outside his organization, would seize it. It wasn't long before Alejandro's most trusted lieutenant, a man named Victor, began to show signs of dissatisfaction. Victor had been with him for years, a fiercely loyal enforcer who had done everything asked of him without question. But as the money and power continued to pour in, Victor started to change. It wasn't that he had become disloyal overnight, rather, Alejandro began to sense a growing restlessness in him. Victor had been quietly building his own network of contacts and making deals on the side. Alejandro could sense the ambition brewing beneath the surface, and while he was no stranger to ambition, he knew that unchecked ambition could destroy everything. Victor's shift in behavior didn't go unnoticed by Alejandro, but he wasn't quick to act. He had learned that sometimes, it was better to let people reveal themselves in their own time. Instead of confronting Victor outright, Alejandro decided to observe. He began to monitor his lieutenant's activities more closely, using his network of informants to keep tabs on him without raising suspicion. It wasn't long before Alejandro had solid evidence that Victor had been cutting deals behind his back. He was trying to expand his influence within the organization, laying the groundwork for his own power grab. The realization that his trusted lieutenant might be plotting against him was a hard blow, but Alejandro was not the type to panic. He knew that power, in the world he inhabited, was often a game of patience. The key was to control the narrative and strike when the time was right. He wasn't interested in a confrontation that would cost him the loyalty of his other men, nor did he want to draw attention to the cracks forming within his ranks. Instead, Alejandro played a long game. He subtly worked to undermine Victor's position, spreading whispers about his ambitions among the other members of the organization. He knew that if he could get enough people to turn on Victor, the lieutenant would be left isolated and vulnerable. It wasn't just about defeating Victor, it was about maintaining the delicate balance that Alejandro had worked so hard to create. The more powerful Alejandro became, the more careful he had to be. He had learned that you couldn't just rely on strength and violence, you had to use manipulation, psychology, and strategy. It wasn't enough to crush your enemies. Sometimes, you had to make them destroy themselves. The tipping point came when Victor, growing increasingly paranoid and desperate, made a fatal mistake. He approached one of Alejandro's closest allies, a man named Carlos, and offered him a deal, an opportunity to join forces and take down Alejandro together. Victor promised Carlos wealth and power beyond his wildest dreams, but what he didn't know was that Carlos was already loyal to Alejandro. When Victor's proposal reached Alejandro's ears, it confirmed what he had suspected all along: Victor was planning a coup. Alejandro's response was swift and decisive. He didn't waste time confronting Victor directly, instead, he made sure that the message was clear to everyone involved. In the dead of night, he called a meeting with the other key members of the organization. With Carlos by his side, Alejandro presented the evidence of Victor's betrayal. There was no drama, no grand speech. Just cold, undeniable facts. Alejandro didn't have to raise his voice, he didn't need to threaten anyone. The others knew exactly what was at stake. The loyalty of the group was paramount, and no one could afford to challenge Alejandro's authority without facing the consequences. Victor, caught off guard, tried to deny the allegations, but the proof was overwhelming. The others had already made up their minds. In the world of organized crime, weakness was a death sentence, and Victor had shown too much of it. Alejandro knew that he couldn't afford to let him live. Victor's actions had been a threat to the entire operation, and in the underworld, betrayal could never go unpunished. But Alejandro was a man of control, and he didn't believe in senseless violence. Instead of taking Victor out in a dramatic fashion, he had him quietly eliminated, without fanfare or spectacle. The message was clear: betrayal would not be tolerated, but it would also not be made public. In Alejandro's world, power was not something to be flaunted, it was something to be maintained with precision and silence. With Victor gone, Alejandro's hold on his organization grew even stronger. But the experience left him shaken. He had learned that no one was truly safe in the criminal world, not even those closest to him. The betrayal of a trusted lieutenant had been a painful reminder of the dangers of power. Alejandro realized that he could no longer rely solely on the loyalty of his men, he had to build a system of checks and balances within his organization to ensure that no one would ever rise up against him again. But even as Alejandro took steps to reinforce his position, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing in the criminal world. The more power he accumulated, the more he realized how precarious it all was. Law enforcement was getting smarter, rivals were becoming more aggressive, and there were whispers of new players entering the game, players who were just as dangerous, if not more so, than Alejandro himself. He knew that in order to survive, he had to keep evolving, keep adapting. If he didn't, someone else would take his place. And so, Alejandro began to expand his empire even further. He started forging alliances with other powerful figures in the criminal world, building a network of influence that reached into politics, law enforcement, and even legitimate businesses. He knew that the key to long-term survival was not just power, but control over every aspect of the game. He had to be untouchable, and to do that, he needed to be everywhere, involved in everything. But as his empire grew, so did the risks. The higher you climbed, the harder it was to stay on top. Alejandro knew that his rise was only the beginning. There were more enemies to face, more challenges to overcome, and more tests of his resolve. But one thing was certain, as long as he played his cards right, Alejandro Serrano would remain a force to be reckoned with in the criminal world. His empire might have been built on the blood and sweat of his enemies, but it was also built on a foundation of cold, calculated strategy. And as long as he stayed ahead of the game, he would continue to rule. As Alejandro Serrano's grip on his growing criminal empire tightened, so did the complexity of the challenges he faced. The more power he gained, the more calculated he had to be in his every move. The criminal underworld, which had once seemed like a game of risk and reward, now felt like a high-stakes chess match. Every action, every alliance, and every decision carried consequences that could ripple across the entire structure of his empire. And in this new phase of his life, Alejandro realized that the greatest threat to his survival wasn't just his enemies, it was the law. For years, Alejandro had managed to keep his operations running smoothly, largely staying under the radar of law enforcement. His ability to slip through their fingers had become legendary, but Alejandro knew that the larger his empire grew, the more likely it was that attention would turn to him. No one, not even the most skilled criminal mastermind, could remain invisible forever. His every move, every deal, would eventually lead to him becoming a target. The question wasn't if the law would come after him, it was when. Alejandro had always been a careful planner, and his ability to stay ahead of the law was no accident. He had built a network that was as much about secrecy and misdirection as it was about power and money. He made sure that every operation had multiple layers of protection, from false identities and hidden locations to trusted intermediaries who acted as buffers between him and his criminal enterprises. Alejandro rarely made direct contact with anyone outside his inner circle, relying on trusted lieutenants and subordinates to execute his plans. His empire had been built on invisibility, and for the longest time, it had worked. But as the scope of his operations expanded, so did the pressure. The authorities had begun to notice the patterns. The law enforcement agencies tasked with taking down organized crime had grown increasingly sophisticated, using wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover agents to infiltrate networks like Alejandro's. There were whispers of an investigation into his activities, rumors that the FBI, the DEA, and local law enforcement had all started to zero in on him. Alejandro knew that he couldn't rely on his old methods forever. His time in the shadows was running out. It was during this period of heightened tension that Alejandro first became aware of a new player in the game, someone who had caught the attention of the authorities and was now making moves in territories Alejandro had long considered his own. This new figure, a young and ambitious mobster named Javier, the Ghost Ruiz, had quickly risen through the ranks of the criminal underworld. Javier was smart, ruthless, and had a reputation for being able to slip past the law as easily as Alejandro had in his early days. And it wasn't just his reputation that made Alejandro take notice, it was the fact that Javier was beginning to move in on the areas where Alejandro had already established his dominance. At first, Alejandro saw Javier as nothing more than a nuisance, another small-time player trying to make a name for himself. But as Javier's operations grew more sophisticated, Alejandro realized that this wasn't just another opportunistic thug. Javier was strategic, calculating, and far more dangerous than he appeared on the surface. He wasn't afraid to take risks, and he wasn't intimidated by Alejandro's reputation. And for the first time in years, Alejandro felt a flicker of doubt. He knew that he had to take action, but the question was how. Javier's rise to power wasn't just about brute force, it was about timing and opportunity. Alejandro had been at the top for years, but in that time, he had also made enemies. Some of those enemies had been allies who had been cut loose as Alejandro's empire expanded. Others were former rivals who had been crushed under his weight. But in the world of organized crime, enemies rarely stayed down for long. And as Javier made his play for territory, Alejandro began to realize that his own empire was more fragile than he had allowed himself to believe. The first real confrontation between Alejandro and Javier came when Javier moved in on one of Alejandro's most profitable operations, a series of high-end money laundering schemes that involved both legitimate businesses and illicit ventures. The operation had been running smoothly for years, generating millions in revenue. But Javier's group had begun to muscle in, offering better deals to Alejandro's business partners and creating a rift in the established order. Alejandro wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but he knew that a direct confrontation with Javier could result in a bloodbath, one that neither side could afford. Instead of going to war with Javier, Alejandro decided to take a more calculated approach. He began to gather information on his rival, using his network of informants and spies to uncover Javier's weaknesses. The more Alejandro learned, the more he realized that Javier's rise had been built on the backs of people Alejandro had once trusted. There were old scores to settle, and Alejandro was determined to settle them on his terms. But the more he delved into Javier's operations, the more Alejandro realized that he couldn't do it alone. This new conflict would require more than just brute strength, it would require a careful, strategic partnership. Alejandro's mind raced as he considered his options. He could fight Javier directly, but the risks were high, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. He could also attempt to outmaneuver him by playing a more subtle game, finding ways to destabilize Javier's empire from within. But that would take time, something Alejandro wasn't sure he had. The authorities were closing in, and every day that passed without a resolution to the conflict meant that the pressure on Alejandro's organization was growing. Then, Alejandro got an unexpected offer from an old ally, a former rival who had been pushed out of the picture when Alejandro's power had grown too large. The offer was simple: help Alejandro deal with Javier, and in return, Alejandro would allow him to reclaim some of the territory he had lost. It was a dangerous proposition, but Alejandro knew that alliances in the criminal world were often forged out of necessity, not friendship. The offer, while risky, could be the key to eliminating Javier once and for all. Alejandro agreed to the deal, but with one caveat: the alliance had to be kept secret. Javier could not know that they were working together. Alejandro understood that the moment Javier became aware of the alliance, it would spark an all-out war. The key to success was secrecy, strategy, and timing. Over the next few weeks, Alejandro and his former rival worked behind the scenes to destabilize Javier's operations. They created divisions within his ranks, fed misinformation, and orchestrated sabotage, all while keeping their involvement hidden. It wasn't long before Javier's empire began to show signs of strain. His men became restless, and his partners started to turn against him. The cracks in his operation were starting to show. But Alejandro knew that he couldn't rely solely on sabotage to win the war. He needed to strike a final blow, something that would cripple Javier's ability to fight back. And that's when Alejandro orchestrated the ultimate move, a move so subtle, so expertly timed, that it would take Javier's entire empire down without a shot being fired. Alejandro knew that in the world he inhabited, survival wasn't just about violence or power, it was about control, timing, and the ability to manipulate every situation to one's advantage. As Javier's empire crumbled, Alejandro's own position in the criminal world became more secure. He had eliminated a threat, but at a great cost. The game had changed, and Alejandro knew that his empire was now at a tipping point. The forces of law, rival gangs, and even his own men were all closing in. The question was no longer if he would be brought down, it was how long he could maintain his grip on the throne. As Alejandro Serrano's empire solidified, the stakes in his world grew even higher. The game had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had once been a realm where violence, intimidation, and carefully curated loyalty ensured his dominance, now had new variables at play: the rise of law enforcement sophistication, the increasing ambition of rival gangs, and the tightening grip of political and financial forces. Alejandro's ability to adapt was tested at every turn, but no challenge was more daunting than the threat of exposure to the authorities who were quietly making headway into his world. For a time, Alejandro had kept his operations carefully hidden. His methods of misdirection and keeping a low profile had been effective, but he had always known that the bigger he got, the harder it would be to stay out of the law's grasp. In the past, his strategy had been to maintain a network of trusted operatives, all of whom worked with plausible deniability, keeping him safely at arm's length from any criminal activities. But the authorities were starting to get smarter. Undercover agents, wiretaps, and advanced surveillance techniques were increasingly common, and the grip of the law was tightening. Alejandro had made a name for himself as someone who could always stay a step ahead. But now, he began to feel the walls closing in. For the first time in his criminal career, he wasn't just worried about a rival trying to overtake him, or a betrayer plotting against him. Now, the biggest threat came from the forces he had worked so hard to avoid, forces beyond his control. As much as he had built an empire through cunning and calculated risk, he knew that the real test was now. How long could he survive in a world where he was constantly under scrutiny? It was a late night when Alejandro first felt the weight of this reality. He had just finished a series of high-level meetings with his inner circle. They had finalized a deal to expand operations into new markets, territories that had been previously untouchable. His men were eager, the profits were potentially massive, and Alejandro's control over the business was growing. But there was an edge to the air that night, a sense that something was wrong. A handful of his most trusted lieutenants had started to behave erratically, shifting their loyalties, and Alejandro knew better than to ignore such signs. He also felt a deep unease, a nagging feeling that his time in the shadows was running out. Just a few days later, the first real indication that law enforcement was closing in came when one of his key operations, a series of illegal arms deals, was raided by federal agents. The operation had been running smoothly for years, hidden in plain sight through a series of shell companies and front businesses. The raid was swift and precise, and it shook Alejandro to the core. He had never believed the authorities would make such a bold move, and for the first time, he found himself questioning the system he had relied on for so long. Alejandro moved quickly. His first step was to assess the damage. He activated a network of informants and operatives to gather intel on what had gone wrong. The raid had been too well coordinated to have been the result of a simple tip-off. Someone in his organization had likely betrayed him, providing crucial information to the authorities. He trusted only a few people to manage such delicate operations, and so he turned to his most loyal advisor, Hector. Hector had been with him for years, and his loyalty had never been in question, until now. Alejandro knew that betrayal could come from anywhere, and he needed to know the full extent of the damage before he took action. The next few days were filled with tense meetings, late-night conversations, and a relentless search for the mole. Alejandro's mind raced as he thought through the possibilities. Who could it have been? A new recruit, perhaps, trying to make a name for themselves. Or one of his old associates, desperate for money or power. Alejandro's ability to keep his operations running smoothly had always been his greatest asset, and now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. The investigation led Alejandro to a man named Victor, a mid-level enforcer in his crew who had shown signs of discontent over the past few months. Victor had once been a reliable asset, but in the past few weeks, his behavior had shifted. He had grown erratic, often asking for more responsibility and questioning Alejandro's decisions. It wasn't long before Alejandro connected the dots. Victor had been spending time with people outside the organization, and some of those people were known to have connections to law enforcement. It was a painful realization for Alejandro. Victor was one of the men he had trusted most, and now, it seemed that trust had been misplaced. But Alejandro didn't allow emotion to cloud his judgment. This wasn't personal, it was business. He couldn't afford to let anyone jeopardize his empire, especially not from within. He called a meeting with his inner circle, and together, they decided on a plan to deal with Victor. There could be no hesitation, no second-guessing. The law had already infiltrated their ranks, and any further exposure could bring down everything Alejandro had built. The plan was swift and efficient. Alejandro's men confronted Victor in a dark alleyway late one evening, away from prying eyes. He had been caught red-handed, and there was no escape for him. Alejandro, always the strategist, made sure the confrontation was clean, precise, and without unnecessary violence. Victor's fate was sealed, but Alejandro needed to send a message to everyone else in the organization: betrayal would not be tolerated. With Victor eliminated, Alejandro turned his focus back to the raid. The authorities would undoubtedly be looking for new leads, and they would expect retaliation from the criminal world. Alejandro's next move was to retreat into the shadows, making himself harder to find. He couldn't afford to be a sitting target, and he knew that the more visible he became, the more the law would be able to track his every move. It was time to become a ghost again, a figure who worked only behind the scenes, pulling the strings without ever being seen. In the weeks that followed, Alejandro put his network of informants and allies to work, quietly dismantling the law enforcement's progress. He used his connections in local government and law enforcement to leak misinformation, turn key witnesses, and plant evidence to confuse the investigation. He didn't need to outfight the authorities, he just needed to outlast them. But the reality of the situation was clear: the game had changed. Alejandro had always known the risks of the life he led, but this felt different. He had been on top for so long, and now, with the law closing in and new, more dangerous rivals emerging from the shadows, Alejandro knew he couldn't continue to rule the same way he had before. The world was evolving, and the old methods of control were no longer as effective as they once were. With his empire in flux, Alejandro began to reconsider his next steps. Should he continue pushing forward, expanding his territory, and risking everything to maintain his grip on power? Or was it time to scale back, consolidate his forces, and bide his time until the authorities lost interest? The decisions ahead were critical. One wrong move could spell the end of everything. For the first time in years, Alejandro found himself at a crossroads. His empire was under threat, and the forces of law and order seemed to be closing in faster than he could react. Yet, despite the growing pressure, one thing was clear: Alejandro Serrano was a survivor. He had weathered storms before, and he would do whatever it took to stay at the top. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about outthinking, outmaneuvering, and always staying one step ahead. As long as he remained in control of the narrative, Alejandro knew he could bend the world to his will. But the game had changed, and so must he. As Alejandro Serrano's criminal empire continued to evolve, he found himself constantly grappling with the pressure of both external threats and internal uncertainty. The law enforcement agencies were relentlessly pursuing him, and his growing list of rivals in the underworld meant that his power was now under constant challenge. But perhaps the most dangerous thing Alejandro faced was not just the threat of the authorities or the ambitions of his enemies, it was the erosion of trust within his own ranks. Power, after all, was not just about strength or wealth, but about loyalty. And as Alejandro soon learned, loyalty was something that could not always be counted on, especially when temptation and self-preservation loomed large. Alejandro had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to know who could be trusted and who could not. His network was built on carefully nurtured relationships, some of which spanned decades. But even the strongest of alliances can begin to unravel when people feel threatened. As Alejandro's empire expanded, so did the risks, and the walls that once seemed so secure now appeared porous. The loyalty of his men, which had once been unwavering, was now being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. It all started with a small crack, an unsettling whisper in the wind. One of his most trusted lieutenants, Carlos, a man who had been with him from the very beginning, had begun acting strangely. Carlos was a quiet, methodical man, a true believer in Alejandro's vision for the future. But lately, he seemed distracted, withdrawn, even evasive. Alejandro had dismissed the behavior at first, attributing it to stress or perhaps the toll of the business. After all, the constant pressure of running a criminal empire could weigh heavily on anyone. But as time went on, Alejandro's instincts told him that there was more to the story. Alejandro had learned long ago that it was the small signs, the subtle shifts in behavior, that could reveal the most. Carlos had stopped attending the regular meetings, claiming to be too busy with other business. When Alejandro called him in for a one-on-one, Carlos's answers were always vague, and his eyes never quite met Alejandro's gaze. It was as though Carlos was hiding something, though Alejandro wasn't sure what. He decided to keep a close eye on him, knowing that his trust in Carlos was crucial to the stability of his operation. Things came to a head when one of Alejandro's most lucrative ventures, an underground gambling operation that was bringing in millions, was hit by a series of unexplained busts. First, a raid in one of the city's oldest casinos, followed by the arrest of several key enforcers within Alejandro's network. The authorities seemed to be one step ahead, and the raids were too well coordinated to be mere coincidences. Alejandro's suspicion grew that someone from within his own circle had been leaking information to the police. The breaking point came when Alejandro received an anonymous tip, an email containing a list of names of those who had been compromised. At the top of the list was Carlos. Alejandro's heart sank. He had never considered that his old friend could be the one to betray him. But the evidence was undeniable. Carlos had been seen meeting with law enforcement officials under the guise of a legitimate business deal. And worse still, there were rumors that Carlos had been promised immunity in exchange for providing information about Alejandro's operations. Alejandro felt a cold knot of betrayal twist in his gut. He knew that in this line of work, loyalty was everything. The moment someone crossed that line, it wasn't just a betrayal, it was a death sentence. Alejandro knew what had to be done. There could be no second chances, no room for mercy. Carlos had to be eliminated. But this wasn't just about business, it was personal. Carlos had been there at the beginning, when Alejandro had nothing but a dream and a handful of men. To lose him now felt like a profound personal failure. But Alejandro also knew that in this world, weakness was more dangerous than any external threat. If he allowed Carlos's betrayal to go unpunished, it would send a message to everyone in his empire, that betrayal was tolerable, that loyalty could be bought. And that was a message Alejandro could never afford to send. But killing Carlos wasn't a simple task. Alejandro had always prided himself on maintaining a sense of control, even in the most brutal moments. He couldn't afford to make this an act of rage, it had to be methodical, planned, and executed without hesitation. Alejandro called a secret meeting with his closest advisors and outlined a plan. They would stage Carlos's death to look like a robbery gone wrong. There could be no trace back to Alejandro, no evidence that would point to him as the mastermind behind it. It was a delicate operation, one that would require precision and perfect timing. The night before the plan was set into motion, Alejandro found himself alone in his office, staring at the city skyline. The lights below twinkled like 1,000 stars, but they felt distant, cold. For the first time in a long while, Alejandro felt the weight of his choices. He had built an empire, yes, but at what cost? The faces of the men he had once trusted flashed before his eyes, Carlos, Hector, even Javier, and he wondered how many more betrayals were lying in wait, how many more cracks in the foundation of his empire would soon appear. In the end, Alejandro knew that loyalty was a currency he couldn't afford to lose. He had invested too much in his empire to let it crumble because of one man's betrayal. The business world he inhabited didn't allow for sentimentality, and he had learned that lesson the hard way. As the night drew on, Alejandro steeled himself for what was to come. The next day, Carlos would be eliminated, and his betrayal would be buried with him. There would be no room for weakness, no time for regret. Alejandro had built an empire on the back of his ruthlessness, and now he would be forced to defend it, no matter the cost. The next day, Carlos met his fate in a quiet alley, far from prying eyes. The plan had gone off without a hitch. Alejandro's men made sure to cover their tracks, leaving no evidence behind. When the news of Carlos's death reached Alejandro, he felt a strange emptiness. The betrayal had been avenged, but the victory felt hollow. He had lost a friend, a trusted ally, and yet the empire continued to stand. The foundations of his world had shifted, but Alejandro knew that he couldn't afford to stop moving forward. The world of organized crime wasn't kind to those who hesitated. In the end, Alejandro understood that loyalty wasn't just something to be rewarded, it was something to be controlled. And in the brutal world he had created, control was the only thing that mattered. Alejandro's world had become a precarious balancing act. With Carlos's betrayal now dealt with, he had regained some sense of control, but the empire he had built was far from secure. His growing list of enemies, both from within and outside his operation, had created a constant atmosphere of tension. Rival gangs were making moves in territories once thought to be firmly under Alejandro's grip, and the authorities, despite their initial setbacks, were still relentlessly pursuing him. The feeling of paranoia was creeping into every decision Alejandro made, and the weight of responsibility for his empire began to feel unbearable at times. As he moved deeper into the heart of his criminal operations, Alejandro realized that his ambition, while never in question, was also the very thing that made him vulnerable. The more power he amassed, the more it attracted attention. It wasn't just about rivals trying to take what he had. Now, law enforcement had begun to understand that Alejandro wasn't just a cog in the machine, he was the machine. He was at the center of a vast, sprawling network that reached far beyond the borders of the city. The longer he remained at the top, the more likely it was that his empire would collapse under the weight of its own ambition. But Alejandro wasn't a man who easily succumbed to fear. He had been through far worse, and he knew that the key to surviving was not avoiding the storm, but learning how to navigate through it. If he was going to continue to lead, he would need to adapt. He couldn't just rely on the old ways of doing things, violence and intimidation. The world was changing, and Alejandro needed to change with it. He started by shifting his focus. No longer would he pour all his resources into the traditional rackets that had made him wealthy. Gambling, loan sharking, and the drug trade were all lucrative, but they were becoming increasingly risky. Law enforcement had figured out the patterns, and with the rise of informants and surveillance technology, Alejandro's old methods were no longer as effective as they once had been. Instead, he began to diversify his empire, looking for new sources of income that could be less visible but just as profitable. One of his most ambitious new ventures was a legitimate business front that would allow him to funnel illicit money into clean operations. It was a strategy he had seen other crime bosses adopt, and it had worked for them. Alejandro's choice was a series of high-end real estate developments, targeting areas on the brink of gentrification. The properties would be sold at inflated prices, with a significant portion of the profits funneled back into his more covert operations. It was a clean way to launder money, and it would also give him the appearance of legitimacy. But Alejandro wasn't blind to the risks. Real estate was a competitive business, and he knew that if the authorities suspected him of using the industry as a front, the consequences could be disastrous. To mitigate these risks, he assembled a team of lawyers, accountants, and business consultants, individuals who had no ties to his criminal activities. They would handle the day-to-day operations, allowing Alejandro to maintain his distance while reaping the rewards. In the early days of this new venture, things seemed to be going smoothly. The real estate projects were thriving, and Alejandro's clean money was flowing in. But as with every part of his empire, there were forces working against him. Some of his rivals, seeing his increasing influence in the real estate market, began to take notice. One such rival was Marco, the Beast, Rinaldi, a notorious mobster known for his ruthlessness and his control over construction and development projects in the city. Marco had built his own real estate empire using intimidation and violence, and he saw Alejandro's rise as a direct challenge to his power. It didn't take long for Marco to make his move. He started to push back against Alejandro's operations, using his own network of thugs to disrupt construction sites and intimidate the contractors Alejandro had hired. At first, Alejandro took a step back, not wanting to escalate things unnecessarily. But as the threats against his men became more violent, he knew he couldn't let Marco push him around. The message had to be clear: Alejandro Serrano wasn't someone to be trifled with. Alejandro decided it was time to send a message of his own. He met with his top enforcers, men like Hector and Javier, who had been with him through the thick and thin, and laid out a plan. They would strike back at Marco's operations, hitting him where it hurt the most, his own real estate holdings. Alejandro wasn't going to let Marco control the game. Instead, he would make it clear that he was the one who called the shots. The operation was executed with precision. Alejandro's men targeted Marco's construction sites, causing significant damage to his machinery and equipment. They also sabotaged several key deals by bribing local officials to revoke permits and licenses. The message was unmistakable: Marco's empire was not as untouchable as he thought. But Alejandro knew that this was just the beginning. Marco wasn't the type to back down easily, and the retaliation would be swift. True to form, Marco responded within days. His men stormed one of Alejandro's construction sites, attacking his workers and destroying valuable equipment. It was an act of war, and Alejandro knew that the situation was about to escalate in ways that could not be controlled. He couldn't afford to let this turn into a full-blown street war, but neither could he afford to show weakness. Alejandro called for a meeting with his most trusted allies. They had to find a way to neutralize Marco without putting their entire empire at risk. The decision was made to take a more subtle approach. Rather than engaging in a public battle, Alejandro would target Marco's finances, the lifeblood of his real estate empire. The plan was to infiltrate Marco's business dealings, using his own contractors and workers to plant false documents and create chaos within his operations. It was a slow burn, but Alejandro knew that in the end, Marco would crumble under the weight of his own mistakes. But as Alejandro set his plan into motion, he realized something that he had long overlooked: his real estate ventures, the ones that had seemed like such a secure and legitimate source of income, were no longer just about money. They were part of something larger, something more dangerous. The game he had been playing was no longer about just surviving in the criminal world, it was about controlling the very structure of the city itself. And as he began to fight Marco Rinaldi on this new battlefield, Alejandro realized that the risks were even greater than he had ever imagined. The stakes were no longer just about his empire, they were about his very survival. With every move, he was walking a razor-thin line between victory and disaster, between power and ruin. Alejandro had built an empire, yes, but now he was forced to confront the truth: maintaining it would be far more difficult than creating it. The days following Alejandro's confrontation with Marco, the Beast, Rinaldi were marked by a heavy silence that hung over the city, one that felt like the calm before an inevitable storm. Alejandro had, in his usual manner, handled the initial clash with calculated precision. He had sent a message to Marco, and for the time being, the power struggle in the real estate world seemed to have reached a fragile stalemate. Yet, despite the outward calm, Alejandro felt a sense of unease creeping into his every decision. The foundations of his empire, which had once seemed so solid, now felt increasingly fragile. His rivals were growing bolder, and the tension with law enforcement was mounting. Alejandro knew that he was not simply fighting for control of a city anymore, he was fighting to protect his very existence. The series of small victories against Marco had bought Alejandro some time, but they had also drawn unwanted attention. It seemed that everyone had begun to take note of his growing influence in the legitimate business world. Real estate, while lucrative, was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it provided Alejandro with a much-needed outlet for his illicit funds, and on the other, it made him vulnerable to scrutiny. It was a dangerous game he was playing, and as he pushed deeper into the world of legitimate business, he found himself entangled in a complex web of politics, public relations, and financial maneuvering. Alejandro had always been able to navigate the underworld with ease, but the world of high-stakes real estate and city development was an entirely different beast. He needed to adapt, to become someone he had never truly been before, a businessman, a public figure who could not simply rely on muscle and threats to get what he wanted. He began to make connections with influential figures, city planners, real estate moguls, and politicians. These men were not like the street-level thugs he had dealt with in the past. They spoke in terms of profit margins, zoning laws, and economic forecasts. They wore expensive suits, drove sleek cars, and spoke the language of power and influence. But Alejandro knew that despite their polished exteriors, many of them were as corrupt as he was. They simply played the game in a different way. One of the key figures Alejandro began to work with was a man named Gregory Nash, a prominent real estate developer with ties to several city officials. Nash was a calculating businessman, and Alejandro quickly saw that he was someone who could be both an ally and a potential threat. Nash had the connections Alejandro needed to push his projects through zoning committees and obtain the permits required to build on prime properties. In exchange, Alejandro provided the financial backing, the muscle when needed, and the political connections that Nash couldn't access. It was a partnership that seemed mutually beneficial, and for a while, it worked like a well-oiled machine. But as Alejandro got deeper into the project, he started to see cracks in the partnership. Nash was ambitious, far more ambitious than Alejandro had originally realized. He began to take more control of their joint ventures, pushing Alejandro out of key decisions and trying to cut him out of the financial side of the deals. It wasn't long before Alejandro began to hear whispers that Nash was working behind his back, using their partnership as a stepping stone to further his own goals. Alejandro's instincts told him that Nash was positioning himself as the new kingpin of the city's development scene, and he couldn't allow that to happen. The more Nash took credit for their successes, the more Alejandro felt his grip on the city slipping. It was the same feeling he had experienced when Carlos had begun to distance himself, when his empire had started to show signs of vulnerability. Alejandro knew that to survive, he would need to reclaim his position at the top. The problem, however, was that Nash had a lot of power and influence, and confronting him directly would be dangerous. Alejandro was no stranger to conflict, but this was different. In the world of real estate development, the stakes were not just physical, they were financial and political. If Alejandro made the wrong move, he could lose everything, his reputation, his money, and perhaps even his freedom. He needed to outsmart Nash, to manipulate the situation in such a way that Nash would either fall in line or be eliminated without causing too much collateral damage to his empire. Alejandro's first step was to gather information. He used his network of informants and trusted operatives to keep tabs on Nash's movements. He learned about Nash's dealings with rival developers, his attempts to secure a merger with a larger development firm, and his increasingly close relationships with certain city officials who were in a position to alter zoning laws to favor Nash's projects. Alejandro realized that Nash was trying to push him out of the business entirely, and if he succeeded, Alejandro would be left with nothing. The plan to neutralize Nash was a delicate one. Alejandro knew that a direct confrontation would only escalate the situation and make him a target. Instead, he began to plant seeds of doubt. He used his influence to start rumors within the development community, suggesting that Nash's projects were unsustainable, that his financial practices were questionable, and that his political alliances were about to implode. Slowly but surely, Alejandro worked to destabilize Nash's position without ever showing his hand. But despite Alejandro's best efforts, Nash proved to be a resilient opponent. He pushed back against the rumors, solidified his political connections, and began to mobilize his own forces to counter Alejandro's moves. Alejandro was not used to losing, and he was not about to let Nash walk away with everything he had worked for. As the pressure mounted, he realized that it was time to take a more drastic measure. He would have to deal with Nash in a way that would send a message to everyone in the city, that no one was beyond Alejandro Serrano's reach, no matter how powerful or untouchable they seemed. The plan was set into motion quietly, behind closed doors. Alejandro used his network of mercenaries and loyal enforcers to infiltrate Nash's operations. They planted false documents that would make Nash's dealings look suspicious, opening the door for law enforcement to investigate him. At the same time, Alejandro had a few well-placed individuals begin to work within Nash's inner circle, feeding him misinformation and sowing distrust among his most trusted allies. It wasn't long before the walls began to close in on Nash. One day, without warning, Nash's empire began to unravel. Several of his major projects were put on hold as city officials began to investigate the allegations against him. His financial backers started to pull out, and the politicians he had once counted on began to distance themselves. By the time Nash realized what had happened, it was too late. His once immense power was slipping through his fingers, and Alejandro stood as the only one left standing in the wake of his downfall. As Nash's empire collapsed, Alejandro watched from the shadows, the satisfaction of victory tinged with a deep, unsettling realization. The game had changed. The stakes were higher than ever before, and in the world Alejandro inhabited, even the slightest misstep could lead to ruin. But one thing was clear, Alejandro had adapted. He had outmaneuvered his enemies, eliminated threats, and solidified his place at the top once again. However, the victory felt different this time. There were no celebrations, no sense of triumph. Alejandro knew that as he had risen, so too had the dangers of his world. There would always be someone waiting to take his place. In the game he played, there could be no room for complacency. Every victory only brought new challenges, and Alejandro knew that he would have to stay one step ahead if he hoped to survive. The real question was, for how much longer could he keep winning before the game finally caught up to him? As Alejandro stood at the precipice of his most recent triumph, the sense of power that once came with every victory now felt more like a burden. The dismantling of Nash's empire had been swift, calculated, and without mercy. The city had watched as the once mighty developer crumbled, and in the aftermath, Alejandro had secured his position at the top. Yet, for the first time in years, he couldn't shake the feeling that the price of this victory was far higher than he had anticipated. There was no relief, no sense of closure. Only the deepening weight of responsibility pressing down on him. In the world he had created, there were no guarantees. Every victory seemed to be followed by an even greater challenge. Alejandro had long ago stopped trusting anyone fully, even his most loyal men. The men who had been by his side from the very beginning, Hector, Javier, and others, were no longer enough to keep the darkness at bay. Alejandro had learned to trust no one completely, not even those closest to him. He had seen too many friends, too many allies, fall victim to ambition, greed, and betrayal. Now, his world felt more fragile than ever. Despite his success, Alejandro was beginning to realize that the line between his criminal empire and the legitimate businesses he was attempting to cultivate was becoming increasingly blurred. He had long since ceased pretending that he was just a businessman. The truth was undeniable, Alejandro Serrano was a kingpin, a man who ruled with an iron fist, controlling everything from the back alleys of the city to the shiny new skyscrapers that now dotted the skyline. His real estate ventures had provided a way for him to launder money and gain access to the kind of political and economic power that few in the criminal world ever achieved. But the deeper he dug into these legitimate businesses, the more entangled he became with the very systems that had always been his enemies. Alejandro's constant dance between the underworld and the boardroom was starting to take its toll. He had always been adept at keeping his hands clean, at maintaining an air of legitimacy, but the reality was that the two worlds were never as separate as he had hoped. Every decision he made seemed to carry weight, and the lines between right and wrong, legal and illegal, had become increasingly difficult to discern. He was no longer just a criminal mastermind, he was a puppet master, pulling the strings behind the scenes in both the public and private sectors. This new reality began to wear on Alejandro's psyche. He couldn't help but feel that he was being swallowed by the very empire he had built. The more he expanded, the more he became trapped in a cycle of power, greed, and paranoia. Each new venture seemed to come with a fresh set of risks, and Alejandro had long since stopped taking anything for granted. His enemies were constantly shifting and evolving, and each move he made seemed to invite new dangers. As his empire grew, so did the number of threats against him. Perhaps the most dangerous of these threats came from the government. Alejandro had always been careful, using a combination of bribery, influence, and sheer force to keep law enforcement at bay. But even the most careful plans could be undone. Alejandro's criminal network was vast, and he had learned to trust his men, but even the most loyal enforcers could be compromised. The more money he laundered, the more attention he attracted. The more power he gained, the harder it became to stay in the shadows. It was during this time that Alejandro began to notice something troubling, a shift in the way the authorities were beginning to approach him. For years, he had been untouchable, a ghost in the system, a name that seemed to slip through the cracks of every investigation. But now, there were signs that his luck was running out. A team of federal agents had begun quietly investigating his business dealings, particularly his real estate operations. Their focus was on the large, multi-million-dollar properties Alejandro had acquired in the past few years, properties that seemed to be nothing more than a front for laundering money. The agents had begun to ask questions, dig deeper, and put together a case. Alejandro couldn't afford to let that happen. The pressure began to mount. Alejandro had always prided himself on his ability to stay one step ahead of the law, but this time felt different. The investigators were thorough, persistent, and determined. For the first time in years, Alejandro found himself considering options that he had long dismissed. He needed to make moves, but the risk was enormous. He couldn't afford to be caught, not now. If the feds were able to connect the dots, if they managed to build a solid case, it would be the end of everything Alejandro had worked for. The empire he had spent decades building would crumble overnight, and he would be left with nothing. Alejandro knew that if he wanted to survive, he would need to act swiftly and decisively. The first step was to sever ties with anyone who could be a liability. He began to quietly distance himself from his business partners, his associates in both the criminal world and the legitimate world. He trusted no one, not even his most loyal men. The threat of betrayal, of someone turning on him, was too great. The feds were getting closer, and Alejandro had no intention of letting them bring him down. At the same time, he knew that he needed to eliminate any loose ends. One of the most dangerous of these loose ends was a man named Victor Delgado, a former associate who had once worked for Alejandro as a middleman in his real estate dealings. Victor had become increasingly erratic in recent months, and Alejandro had heard rumors that he was talking to law enforcement. Alejandro's instincts told him that Victor was a liability, and if he didn't deal with him soon, Victor's loose lips could sink the entire operation. The plan was simple: eliminate Victor, make it look like an accident, and erase all traces of his involvement. Alejandro didn't like killing his own men, especially those who had once been close allies, but he knew that there could be no mercy in his world. It was a harsh reality, but it was one Alejandro had accepted long ago. As the weeks passed, the plan was put into motion, and Victor was taken care of quietly, without fanfare. There would be no investigation, no questions asked. The operation continued. But even as Alejandro made the necessary moves to protect his empire, there was a creeping doubt that began to take hold of him. The world he had created, the one where he was untouchable, was no longer as stable as it once had been. His rise had been meteoric, but now the risks were too high. The weight of his empire, both criminal and legitimate, was growing too heavy to bear. And as he looked at the men around him, those who had helped him build it all, Alejandro couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep up the charade. The empire was his, but it felt like it was slowly slipping from his grasp. And in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the question: how long could he keep running before the law, or someone else, finally caught up to him? It was clear to Alejandro now: survival was a never-ending game, and in the world he had created, victory was fleeting. The more he won, the more there was to lose. Alejandro knew that his time was running out. Despite the calculated measures he had taken to cover his tracks, the shadows of his past, his criminal dealings, his double life, were closing in around him. He could feel it, the creeping sense of inevitability. The feds were on his trail, his enemies were lurking in the periphery, and even the people he once considered loyal were beginning to question his motives. There was no longer any room for complacency. Every decision he made could be his last. The empire he had built, brick by brick, seemed to be unraveling at the seams. The question now was not if it would fall, but when. The pressure was immense. Alejandro had always prided himself on his ability to stay ahead of the game, to outthink and outmaneuver anyone who stood in his way. But this was different. This time, it wasn't just a matter of dealing with a few rivals or cleaning up a mess. This was survival. The stakes had never been higher. Alejandro had long since stopped trusting anyone, even those closest to him. Everyone had their price, everyone had their breaking point, and he was no longer willing to gamble with his life or his empire. As the walls closed in, he knew that he had to take drastic action, or risk losing everything. For years, Alejandro had kept his distance from the authorities, his criminal empire running smoothly under the radar. But now, it seemed like the walls were closing in on him faster than ever. His every move was being watched, every phone call traced, every financial transaction analyzed. Even his legitimate business dealings, the ones that had provided him with a veneer of respectability, were under the microscope. Alejandro had always been careful, keeping his criminal operations separate from his real estate ventures, but the lines had blurred over time. The more successful he became, the more attention he drew. And now, that attention was threatening to unravel everything. As he sat in his penthouse office, overlooking the city that had been both his kingdom and his prison, Alejandro felt a growing sense of dread. The familiar hum of the city, the constant buzz of activity, now seemed like an echo of something he could no longer control. The power he had once wielded with ease now felt distant, almost intangible. The men who had once sworn loyalty to him were starting to question his decisions, to wonder if the empire was truly as secure as he had once promised. In the criminal underworld, loyalty was everything, but even loyalty had its limits. And Alejandro knew that trust was a rare commodity in his world, one that could be easily broken. It was in these moments of isolation, when the weight of his empire pressed down on him, that Alejandro began to doubt himself. Was it worth it? All the years of bloodshed, of manipulation, of deceit? What had he truly gained? Money, power, respect, but at what cost? He had built a legacy, yes, but it was a legacy built on lies, on violence, on a never-ending cycle of control and betrayal. And now, it seemed that the very forces he had worked so hard to subvert were closing in on him. The realization was sobering. Alejandro had always been in control, always the one pulling the strings. But now, he found himself in a position where he was no longer certain of the outcome. The law was no longer a distant threat, it was a tangible, breathing entity, and it was coming for him. He had lived his life in the shadows, but those shadows were shrinking with every passing day. It was only a matter of time before someone, whether law enforcement or a rival, would make their move. In the days that followed, Alejandro took stock of his situation. He began to reconsider his options, weighing the risks of continuing to fight against the mounting forces that were closing in on him. The idea of fleeing, of leaving the life he had built, was tempting. He could disappear, go underground, leave everything behind and start anew. But the thought of giving up his empire, of walking away from the life he had worked so hard to create, was unthinkable. The idea of losing everything, of being forced to live a life in hiding, gnawed at him. And so, he doubled down. Alejandro began to make plans for his future, but these plans were different. He could no longer rely on brute force or intimidation to maintain his grip on power. He needed to be smarter, more strategic. The key to his survival, he realized, was going to be in his ability to outthink and outmaneuver the forces that were arrayed against him. But this time, it wasn't just about surviving, it was about securing his legacy. If he couldn't escape the law, then he would ensure that his empire lived on in a different form. The question was, who could he trust to help him achieve that? One of the few men Alejandro still trusted completely was Hector, his right-hand man. Hector had been with Alejandro from the beginning, a loyal enforcer who had helped him build his empire from the ground up. Hector was more than just a bodyguard or a soldier, he was a strategist in his own right, someone who understood the complexities of running a criminal organization. Alejandro knew that Hector's loyalty was unwavering, but even so, he kept him at arm's length. In a world where betrayal was a constant threat, Alejandro couldn't afford to be too close to anyone. But now, Alejandro had no choice. He needed to bring Hector in on his plans, to involve him in the future of their empire. Together, they began to devise a strategy that would secure their position in the criminal underworld while also protecting Alejandro from the growing threat of law enforcement. It was a delicate balance, one that required careful maneuvering, but Alejandro was confident in his ability to navigate these treacherous waters. After all, he had made it this far by outsmarting his enemies at every turn. The plan they developed was bold, risky, and, if successful, would ensure that Alejandro's legacy lived on. The key to their survival, they realized, lay in shifting their operations into more subtle, less visible ventures. Real estate would still be the backbone of their empire, but it would no longer be the only source of revenue. Alejandro began to pour money into other, more discreet ventures, high-end casinos, private security firms, luxury goods. These businesses would serve as a front, a way to launder money without drawing the same level of attention. But the real strength of the plan lay in Alejandro's ability to manipulate the political and business elites. With the right connections, he could shield himself from legal repercussions and continue to operate with impunity. But the more Alejandro thought about his future, the more he realized that his empire, as it stood, was not sustainable. The world was changing. Technology was advancing, law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated, and the public was increasingly aware of the corruption that ran through the veins of the city. It was only a matter of time before the old ways of doing business would no longer work. Alejandro knew that he had to adapt, to evolve, if he was going to survive. It was a sobering thought, but it was one that Alejandro had to accept. The life he had lived, the one he had fought so hard to create, was coming to an end. It was time to pivot, to reinvent himself once again. The question was not whether he could survive, but how. And Alejandro Serrano, the man who had built an empire from nothing, was never one to give up without a fight. As the weeks went by, Alejandro's anxiety grew. He could feel the tension building, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. He had spent so many years building his empire, stacking layer upon layer of power, wealth, and influence. Now, it seemed that everything was on the verge of crumbling. The authorities were closing in, and even the most loyal of his men were beginning to show signs of doubt. Alejandro had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his empire, but for the first time, he felt like he was losing control. His carefully crafted world of shadows and secrets was no longer as secure as it had once been. The government's investigation into his real estate ventures had escalated, and the agents who had once been content to follow leads were now taking a more aggressive approach. There were whispers of wiretaps, surveillance cameras in his buildings, and informants within his inner circle. The pressure was mounting, and Alejandro could feel the noose tightening around his neck. But even as the walls closed in, Alejandro refused to back down. He had spent his entire life building this empire, and he would not let it slip through his fingers so easily. There was no room for weakness, no time for hesitation. He would fight back, as he always had, and find a way to outsmart his enemies. But as he sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time would be different. This time, his usual tricks and tactics might not be enough. Alejandro's mind raced as he thought about his options. There were always ways to move money, to manipulate the system, to use his connections in the business and political world to keep his operations running smoothly. But with the authorities breathing down his neck, those avenues were becoming less viable. Every move he made seemed to attract more attention, more scrutiny. It was as though the world was starting to see through his facade. It was then that Alejandro realized that he had reached a crossroads. His options had become limited, and the path forward was unclear. He could no longer rely on brute force alone to maintain his power. The time had come for him to adapt, to think more strategically than ever before. He needed to find a way to outmaneuver the authorities, to secure his position while keeping the empire intact. But the most pressing question remained: who could he trust? In the past, Alejandro had been able to rely on a close circle of loyal men, but now even that was in question. Loyalty was a rare commodity in his world, and the more successful he became, the more people sought to undermine him. It wasn't just the feds he had to worry about. There were rival factions within the criminal underworld, each one eager to carve out their own piece of the pie. Alejandro had always been careful about who he associated with, but now the very foundation of his network was starting to crack. The sense of paranoia was overwhelming. Alejandro found himself second-guessing even the most trusted members of his crew. Could Hector still be trusted? Was Javier truly loyal, or was he biding his time, waiting for the right moment to make a move? These questions plagued Alejandro's mind as he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse. The very people who had helped him rise to power now felt like potential threats. But there was one man Alejandro knew he could still rely on: himself. He had always been a master manipulator, able to twist situations in his favor with a few well-placed words or a timely gesture. He had built an empire from nothing, and he wasn't about to let it slip away because of a few setbacks. Alejandro began to put his mind to work, trying to think of a way out, a way to shift the balance in his favor once again. The answer came to him in a moment of clarity. If he couldn't rely on his old methods, he would have to create new ones. He would need to move even further into the shadows, to operate with even greater secrecy. He would need to leave behind the very structures that had made his empire so successful, his businesses, his connections, and start over. It was a radical idea, one that would require careful planning and execution, but Alejandro was nothing if not resourceful. The plan he developed was daring, perhaps even reckless, but it was the only option left. He would go underground completely. He would sever ties with everyone, including his most loyal allies, and disappear into the criminal world once more. The empire he had built would continue, but he would operate from the shadows, a ghost in the machine. He would build a new network, one that was more decentralized, more fluid, harder to trace. In time, he would rebuild his influence, but this time, he would do it in a way that the authorities could never touch. To execute this plan, Alejandro would need to move quickly and decisively. The first step was to disappear from the public eye. He would stage his own death, making it look like he had been the victim of a botched assassination attempt. The authorities would believe it, and his enemies would believe it as well. Alejandro would be gone, leaving behind only a trail of confusion and chaos. From there, he would take on a new identity, one that would allow him to operate freely, without the scrutiny that came with his old name. As Alejandro began to put the pieces in motion, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had started with nothing, just a young man with ambition and a ruthless streak. Now, he had built an empire, but at what cost? The friends he had lost, the enemies he had made, the lives he had destroyed, everything had led him to this moment. He had always known that power came with a price, but he had never fully understood the weight of that price until now. The idea of disappearing from the world he had built was unsettling. It was almost like giving up, like admitting defeat. But Alejandro was a survivor. He had learned long ago that in his world, there was no room for sentimentality. His empire was no longer about wealth or influence, it was about survival. And if disappearing into the shadows was what it took to survive, then so be it. As the final preparations for his disappearance fell into place, Alejandro's mind raced with the possibilities. He had always been a man of action, but now, more than ever, he needed to be patient. The next phase of his life would be different. It would be quieter, less visible. But it would still be his empire, his creation. He would be the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes, a ghost in the machine. And as Alejandro looked at the city below, the city that had once been his to command, he realized something: no matter how much he changed, no matter how much he adapted, he would always be a part of this world. The darkness, the shadows, the power, these were the things that had shaped him, and they would continue to shape him, no matter where he went. The game would never truly end. It would simply change form. And Alejandro Serrano, the mastermind who had slipped through the law time and time again, would find new ways to survive. The game was far from over, it had only just begun. Alejandro's life was no longer about wealth or the thrill of power, it had become a game of survival. The steps he had taken to disappear, to slip out of sight and live in the shadows, had worked for the time being. But even as he adjusted to his new, low-profile existence, something gnawed at him from within. The deeper Alejandro delved into his reinvention, the more it seemed like a quiet surrender, a giving up of the very things he had once held dear. His empire was still there, still operating under the surface, but Alejandro wasn't the same man anymore. In the stillness, he began to feel an unsettling distance between the life he had once built and the quiet existence he had chosen. His network of loyalists, the few who had been in on his disappearance, were operating without him at the helm. They were managing the day-to-day operations, the front businesses, and the money-laundering schemes that had once been his pride and joy. But despite their loyalty, Alejandro couldn't shake the feeling that the world was moving forward without him. What had once been his intricate web of influence had started to fray at the edges. The absence of his personal touch, his calculated decision-making, left a gap in the organization, a space that some of his subordinates were eager to fill. It was a slow process, but it was happening, and Alejandro knew that it was only a matter of time before his carefully built network started to unravel. The fear of losing control, of becoming just another forgotten ghost in the criminal underworld, began to consume him. He had thought that stepping away from the game, disappearing, would bring peace, but it only created a new kind of tension. His every action felt calculated, but not in the way it used to. Before, Alejandro had been the one pulling the strings, the one guiding the destiny of his empire. Now, he was a shadow, a figurehead, watching from the sidelines as others took the reins. The illusion of power was still there, but it didn't feel the same. It was during one of his rare visits to the city, when he was watching from a distance, that Alejandro realized just how much his absence had affected everything. The streets were still filled with the same faces, the same transactions taking place, but the one stronghold of his influence had started to shift. Other figures, smaller players, had begun to rise in prominence. Men who once owed their success to Alejandro's guidance now seemed content to operate independently, carving out territories for themselves. This realization sparked a renewed sense of urgency in Alejandro. He had always known that the underworld was a transient place, that loyalty was as fleeting as the next opportunity, but seeing it firsthand reminded him of how fragile everything really was. His empire was teetering on the brink of something catastrophic, and yet, Alejandro felt like he was helpless to stop it. It wasn't just the law closing in anymore, it was the decay of his own empire from within. Alejandro had never been one to sit idly by when the odds were stacked against him. But now, the choices seemed more difficult than ever. He could continue to stay in the shadows, hoping his loyalists would manage to hold everything together, or he could re-enter the game and take back control. But doing so meant returning to a world he had tried to escape, the world of danger, deceit, and the constant threat of betrayal. It meant risking everything once again, including his freedom, and in his case, his life. As he sat in his nondescript apartment, the walls feeling smaller than ever, Alejandro began to weigh his options. He knew that he couldn't simply walk away from his empire, no matter how much he had convinced himself otherwise. The power, the control, it was all still a part of him. It had been his lifeblood for so long, and even in his solitude, he couldn't completely sever the ties that bound him to that world. The idea of watching his empire fall apart without lifting a finger was unbearable to him. The question was no longer about how to survive, it was about whether he could rise once again and reclaim his throne, or whether the very foundations he had built would collapse from under him. The truth was, Alejandro missed the rush, the game of it all. There was something undeniably intoxicating about the way his empire had worked, the intricate dance of power, manipulation, and control. He had been the king of his domain, and no matter how far he tried to retreat from that world, it still called to him. There was always something new to conquer, something to build, someone to manipulate. It was a never-ending cycle, but it was one that Alejandro had mastered. But now, things were different. The game had changed. The old rules no longer applied. He couldn't simply walk back in and take control as he once had. The world had become more interconnected, more surveilled, and the forces that had once been easily manipulated, law enforcement, rival gangs, even the public, were now more sophisticated than ever. There were fewer opportunities to slip between the cracks, fewer ways to move undetected. Alejandro knew that if he wanted to take back control, he would have to be smarter, more elusive, than ever before. He began to formulate a plan, a new strategy that would allow him to re-enter the game, but this time, on his terms. The first step would be to quietly assess the situation. He would need to observe the rising players in his absence, understand their strengths and weaknesses, and figure out where the cracks in the empire had appeared. The second step would be to rebuild his influence, but this time, he would have to do it with a lighter touch. No more direct control, no more visible leadership. He would need to operate behind the scenes, pulling strings from afar, like the ghost of a king who had once ruled. But Alejandro also knew that the time for subtlety would be limited. At some point, he would have to re-emerge in a more prominent way, but he couldn't do that without ensuring his safety. The authorities would be watching, as would his enemies. The last thing he needed was to make a move that would draw attention. Everything had to be calculated, precise. The old Alejandro, the one who had thrived on boldness and risk, was no longer a viable version of himself. Now, he would have to adapt once again, to be more cautious, more patient. In his world, timing was everything. It was a delicate balance, playing the game from the shadows while still maintaining enough presence to steer it. But Alejandro had always been good at adapting, at reinventing himself when necessary. He had built his empire once before, and he was determined to do it again. The pieces were slowly falling into place, and soon, he would re-enter the world he had once ruled. But this time, it would be on his terms, not as a figurehead, not as a fading memory, but as a mastermind once more. His empire was far from over. In fact, it was about to be reborn. And this time, nothing and no one would stand in his way. Alejandro's re-entry into the criminal world was a quiet one, a slow and deliberate maneuver that began in the darkest corners of the city. He was no longer the brash, visible leader who ruled the streets with charisma and brute force. He had become something more elusive, more like a shadow in the night. The transition from the life he had once led to this quieter, more calculated existence was not without its challenges. There were moments when Alejandro questioned whether the risks were worth it, but deep down, he knew that stepping back into the world of power, control, and influence was inevitable. It was the only world he had ever truly known. His strategy was one of observation. He would sit on the sidelines, watch the players he had once controlled, and learn from their moves. The landscape of the criminal world had shifted in his absence. New alliances had formed, new players had risen, and the underworld had taken on a different shape. Alejandro's once solid grip on the streets had loosened, but he was not about to let it slip entirely. He had spent years building his empire, and now it was time to understand its current state, to identify its weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The first piece of his plan was to quietly reconnect with old contacts, men and women who had once worked for him or with him, but who had since fallen out of the loop. Some had retired from the game, others had moved into different parts of the world, but many still held valuable knowledge of what was happening on the streets. Alejandro didn't need to make waves, he just needed to listen, gather information, and begin to form a new network. It was a delicate process. He couldn't afford to attract attention, but the pull of his influence, even from the shadows, was undeniable. People remembered him, remembered the way he operated. And those memories could be both a blessing and a curse. As the weeks passed, Alejandro began to rebuild his network, but it was a far more fragmented one than he had ever known. The underworld was no longer the close-knit, tightly controlled organization he had once led. It had splintered into factions, each one vying for power and control. Old loyalties had been replaced by opportunism, and the fragile alliances that had once kept the peace were now shifting and unstable. It was a reflection of the changing dynamics of the world itself, more dangerous, more unpredictable, and far more difficult to navigate. Alejandro had to be careful. The men who had once been his most trusted allies were now spread thin, each with their own agendas, each more concerned with their own survival than with maintaining loyalty to a man who had disappeared for years. Some of them, however, had not forgotten the power he once wielded. A few still believed in his ability to lead, and as he slowly started to make his presence known again, they began to reach out, testing the waters, offering their support. But Alejandro was no fool. He knew that in this world, trust was a commodity that could be bought and sold, but it was never guaranteed. Loyalty was a fragile thing, especially in the criminal underworld, where betrayal was as common as success. Alejandro had seen it all, the backstabbing, the lies, the manipulation, and he had been the one pulling the strings. Now, he had to navigate through this treacherous web of old friends, former enemies, and new players with the same sharp instincts that had gotten him to the top in the first place. As his network began to grow, so did the risks. Alejandro's re-emergence was not unnoticed. The authorities, always keen on sniffing out any sign of criminal activity, had started to take an interest in the patterns of his old businesses, even though they had been dormant for some time. Alejandro had been careful not to leave a trail, but the mere fact that some of his old associates were resurfacing had caught the attention of law enforcement. They had questions, and they were determined to find answers. The stakes were high, and Alejandro knew that any misstep could lead to exposure, or worse, an arrest. He had always been able to avoid the law in the past, but now the world was a different place, more connected, more surveilled. Every move mattered. But Alejandro had one advantage that most others in his position didn't, his experience. He had spent years evading capture, always thinking 2 steps ahead of his enemies, always finding a way to slip through the cracks. This was no different. He knew that to stay ahead of the authorities, he would have to be patient, calculated, and careful. He couldn't afford to make rash decisions or take unnecessary risks. The game had changed, and so had the rules. To protect himself, Alejandro began to lay down a new foundation, one that was far less visible, far harder to trace. He would operate in the background, setting up legitimate businesses as fronts, masking the true nature of his dealings. These businesses would provide cover for his operations, making it more difficult for the authorities to track him. Alejandro had always been a master of misdirection, and now he would use that skill to its fullest extent. His plan was to remain a ghost in the system, someone who could move through the shadows without ever being seen. But even ghosts had to be careful where they walked. The deeper Alejandro sank into the underworld, the more he realized how much had changed during his absence. The old world, the one he had once dominated, was no more. The new world was more fragmented, more violent, and more unpredictable. But Alejandro had survived in the past because he was able to adapt. And now, as he re-entered the game, he knew that it was his adaptability that would keep him alive. He didn't need to be the most powerful man in the room anymore, he just needed to be the one who always stayed one step ahead. Despite the challenges, Alejandro's confidence began to grow again. As he worked quietly behind the scenes, pulling the strings, building alliances, and gathering information, he felt a sense of purpose return. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was enough. He was no longer the head of a vast empire, but he was still the man who could make things happen. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The game was still in play, and Alejandro was ready to take it on, this time with more wisdom, more patience, and more caution. The empire would rise again, but this time, Alejandro would be the one to shape it in his image, slowly, silently, and with the precision of a master. As Alejandro's influence began to stretch once more through the city's undercurrents, his need for discretion grew. He couldn't afford to be seen, to draw any attention that might expose his hand. His operations had to be tighter, quieter, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed of power or danger. Instead of grand gestures, he relied on subtlety. It was no longer about grandeur, but about resilience. Every move was measured, calculated. The network he was rebuilding was slowly coming together, but it was fragile, like thread spun in the dark. He could feel the tension in the air. Old enemies were beginning to stir, sniffing around his newfound activities. Alejandro could sense their distrust, their suspicion. They hadn't forgotten who he was, and they didn't like the idea of someone slipping back into the scene without their knowledge. Even so, Alejandro moved with precision, forging alliances where he could, while keeping his true intentions veiled. His empire had once been a roaring force of nature, but now it was a more quiet, methodical thing, waiting for the right moment to strike. Patience, Alejandro knew, was just as powerful as any weapon. And soon, it would be his time again, but he had to wait for the right opportunity, the perfect moment to reveal himself.